what does it truly mean to be strong? And how can knowing and honoring our own limits lead, paradoxically, to generosity and abundance? These are some of the questions I'm excited to explore with fourth generation entrepreneur and master Sufi teacher and healer Mark Silver in this conversation about the classical Tamil masterpiece on ethics, power, and love, the Kural, or in short, the Kural. I'm Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma, and I've spent more than 20 years exploring the abundance of the Kural, and just as much time becoming strong enough in my own poetic practice to be able to translate it into English. And because this is a work which remains astonishingly relevant to our time, and also speaks so directly to so many areas of our lives, I've been inviting people into conversation, poets and translators, but also healers and artists and teachers of all kinds, to explore particular key verses as a way to open up the riches, if you will, and the wonder of this work of wisdom literature. My guest today, in fact, I have two guests today. One is the rain, which you may be able to hear lightly on the roof. We've had rain on and off today, and right now you're hearing, if you're hearing it, you're hearing the drops falling from the wet branches overhead. So we may have visitors in the forms of these raindrops. And I mention it not only because we can hear this, but also because the Kural itself is a work that celebrates and embodies a deep awareness of our more than human world. To give just one example, the second chapter after first chapter, which could be translated as in praise of God, or in praise of the gods, or even in praise of the godlike qualities of great teachers, the very second chapter is called in praise of rain, and celebrates the rain that nourishes us and that makes life on earth possible. And so the rain is very much a part of the sensibility of the Kural. So I'm glad that the rain has joined us here today. And I'm also very glad to have Mark Silver, who is the founder of Heart of Business, which helps people who want to serve the world with their work to do so in a way that feels good to their hearts and is also financially sound and sustainable. I have followed Mark's work for almost a decade and have had the great privilege and honor of learning from and with him. So it's really a delight and a deep pleasure to have you here with me today, Mark.
I'm just thrilled to be invited into this, Thomas, and I'm excited about what we're digging into. It was well chosen, the chapter that you offered to me to contemplate.
Wonderful. So for those listening or watching, what I've done is I've shared a particular chapter from the book with Mark Silver. And this book has 133 different chapters, short chapters. And each of these chapters deals with some particular aspect of life. And so the chapter that I thought would be interesting to discuss is chapter 48 on knowing strength. And in the original context, this is a chapter that would be addressed toward a leader, toward leaders, with an eye toward what a leader needs to know to be a good leader, whether it's the leader of a household or of a kingdom, of a reign, of a queendom, or some other kind of organizational or community entity. And I think that in the present time, we can look at a chapter like this and see in it, discover in it wisdom for how do we not only act as a leader in whatever sphere we may be a leader, even if we don't even think of ourselves as leaders, but beyond that, to this very specific question of what does it mean to know our own strength, and how does that connect with how we grow? So this is the chapter I've shared with Mark, and I'm curious, Mark, and when you first looked at the chapter, what's one of the verses that may have stood out to you or resonated with your own sense of things?
There were quite a few things that jumped out at me, and I have to say that the first thing that jumped out at me, and I'm guessing that this doesn't translate and it might only apply in the English, but it's like the title of the chapter, Knowing Strength. We can understand that as knowing, like the knowledge of strength, or we could understand it as strength that knows. that an aware, like strength that has awareness. And it comes to me like, I practice in the Islamic Sufi tradition, and there's a verse in the Quran that says, God sees the black ant on a black rock at midnight and knows its needs and gives to them. And there's also the story of the armies of Solomon rushing to war, and then but the ants crying out, and then the soldier like taking care to not step on the ants. And just how much, like, when we have strength, like strength has to be divine, to be holy, to be just, has to have this awareness and knowledge. It can't just be a mindless strength, but rather a knowing strength. No idea if that's held at all in the original language, but I can't even tell you how strongly that jumped out at me.
Well, I love that jumped out at you, Mark, because one of my highest aims in carrying out this translation has been to create, to offer a translation which can read in this way, which is deliberately not so much that I've hoped that you would have that particular interpretation, but that it would be open to that possibility. And I, with every single choice I've made with the translation, that's my hope. And so I couldn't be more delighted that just the chapter title alone has spoken to you in more than one way, because that's of the nature of this particular book, that every verse, every phrase, every chapter title has that capacity. So I'm honored and delighted that you draw that to our attention.
I was also struck in the very first verse: assess a deed's power, one's power, opponent's power, and the power of one's friends, then act. And there's a very strategic way of thinking about that. Of course, it's like, who are all the, what's everybody got going on, and how's it going to work? And if I do this, what's going to potentially oppose me or support me in moving forward? And again, it's for me, of course, it's the first verse, and it came right off that chapter title. Just thinking about, where does power reside? Like, where does power live? What is power? From a Sufi perspective, power is not something that human beings own or manufacture or create. It's considered, there are 4 inherent qualities of the human being. There is humility, ignorance, weakness, and poverty. Those are our inherent qualities as human beings, disconnected. It's like it speaks to the vessel-like nature of the human being, and how we're a vessel to receive and express divine qualities like strength. And strength actually has different flavors. And anyway, that's another thing. But I love how this verse names power as residing in different places, that it's not something that can be captured or monopolized or held strictly in one place. And that it's not just something about, it's not even just owned by a human being. There's the deed itself has a power inherent in it that is separate from the person taking the action, which is a beautiful picture. And then when you said the power of one's friends, there's a podcast I listened to that's entitled All My Relations, and it's hosted by Native Americans, Indigenous Americans living in the U.S., and it speaks to how in their way of holding the world, that everything is our relation. That we're related to everything, to the animals, to the land, to the plants, to there's we're this relational aspect. And that's also at the heart of Sufism, how everything is a relationship. And I was thinking about the power of one's friends, and just how deeply we're cared for and supported, that we're not alone in moving in the world, that the deed itself carries power, that the power, the strength itself has a knowingness and an awareness, and that um, and that the and that we have so many friends and relations and support, uh, and that they're like the supportive powers far outnumber the opponent's powers. And I just was struck by how hopeful even the construct. And again, I don't know what the original was. I'm always interested in that because my tradition also comes from a different language, Arabic, or I was raised Jewish and Hebrew. And so there's always to me a sensitivity around, okay, well, English has a particular flavor and way of dealing with concepts that's inseparable from the language, and other languages really carry a different worldview that's in the grammar and the vocabulary. And so I'm just aware of that. But the way that you've translated this and constructed it, like the opponent's power is surrounded by all this other power. Like it's not, you're not like staring across a battlefield at it, or it's not blocking the way. It's like it's surrounding it and outnumbers it. And how hopeful that is. And I think that then another piece in this phrase is like, and then act. It's like you're in the assessment phase of the power, of the ability to have it happen. And because this is about strength, there's an assumption, given the wisdom and the context of the larger work, that, the one before is clarity before action, chapter before. And that there's already been an assessment of whether the deed is worth doing, is whether it's the right thing to do. And so standing in the awareness that this deed is worth doing, that the power itself has a knowledge, and the deed itself has a power, and that anything that's blocking it, if it's the right action, the opponents are outnumbered so tremendously by all of our relations and all of our friends, and the power in the deed itself. It just spoke to me very profoundly at those multiple levels.
That's so beautiful. I really honor what you see, how you're experiencing, how you've shared your experience of this verse. As you were speaking, Mark, I was thinking about how this work embodies there's an ecology to the work. I mean, there's a deep ecological sensibility to the work, but even there's an ecology of the words on the page. And as I say this, you may be able to hear there's a plane overhead, and so that along with our guest, the rain, the drops, which are sort of starting to peter out. There's also, the sound of this other thing, this airplane flying through the air, which in my experience is deeply ambiguous, because on the one hand, it can represent the possibility of travel, maybe traveling to the side of a loved one, or going on a pilgrimage. And at the same time, we're increasingly aware, all of us, of the cost of such forms of travel, and whether it really is a form of travel that fits everything. So all of these things are part of the bigger picture. And one of the things that this work does is to capture something of that ecology. So even here, there's a kind of ecological relationship, if you will, between the title and then this first line, and the way that you were perceiving how the words were inhabiting, if you will, that line, I think is very true to the work, which is that that there is this ecology of power as well that we are involved in, and that indeed our circle of friends who we may be shy about asking for help from may be indeed far more powerful in a holy sense, in a sacred sense, than we may even be able to imagine. And similarly, that one's friends needn't simply be human friends, as much as we cherish our human friends, but there's a way in which the whole world can become a form of the friend, if you will. That our our relations with night and with day, with animals, with the sounds in the air, welcomed and unwelcomed, with the animals that we live with and among and through. All of those elements belong. And so I really honor and cherish what you're helping me to see, because I've lived with some of these verses 20 plus years, and yet I'm still coming to see things in them. I'm still coming to taste things in them, which is, I think, of the nature of a poem of this kind. Speaking of which, I'm curious, having sort of traveled from the chapter heading to the first poem, what else may have jumped out at you?
Well, in this enveloping sense, if I go to the last verse, generosity that doesn't know what one has destroys what one has. And it's, I think, I mean, the way that it reflects the knowing strength and the knowledge that's inherent in strength, that, it's like, it reminds me of a Sufi teaching that says that, compassion without truth is not compassion, and truth without compassion is not truth. And, generosity without knowledge is not generosity. It's like, that's a teaching that's come in very strongly. I remember my sheikh, Sidi Muhammad al-Jamal, who lived in Jerusalem and was a teacher at the Al-Aqsa, at the holy Masjid Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. We can only give what we've been given. We can only give from what we actually have. It's like such a clear warning that it's not just power used badly that destroys, but it's actions without knowledge that can tear down, actions without awareness, actions without care, even really actions that we would count as positive. When I think about generosity, if we give to such an extent that it pulls ourselves down. In fact, it was funny. I was on a podcast interview earlier today, and we were talking about, heart-centered leadership and caring, and I was talking about my past as a paramedic years ago, and how the patient is actually the fourth priority. The first priority is yourself, the second is your partner, the third is other emergency personnel, and the fourth is the patient. And that's all in service to the patient, because if we get hurt, then we need help, and then suddenly one ambulance is out of service and they're sending two ambulances, one to me and one to the original patient. And it just like, it compounds things so badly in such a terrible way. And when I think about this generosity, like when we give in ways that harm ourselves, and when we're not aware of what we actually have, like we have the power to destroy ourselves through good works, through what might be termed good or thought of as good works. And it's not helpful. Now, I think that it's very telling that the verse doesn't say generosity that reduces you to poverty destroys you, because I think that there are moments when we are asked to give everything, whether that's in a spiritual sense or a physical sense or a financial sense. There are times when we're really asked to give in ways that stretch us or that leave us with much less than what we had. But it's done with awareness. It's the generosity without awareness that destroys. And I just love how that sense of knowledge and awareness is reflected from the title down to the final verse, and kind of wrapping the whole chapter in what is seems like so elemental to strength and power, which is knowledge. This knowledge that you can't be compassionate without this knowledge.
That's also very, very beautifully and powerfully put. I'm struck by something that you've picked up on, which is that although each of these verses can and often do stand on their own, and they stand on their own in a way similar to this idea that you were sharing from your experience as a paramedic, that, here are the four things that you need to think about in any assessing a situation, assessing whether to act, getting that clarity before action. And these verses can work in that way. They can be like that. Oh yeah, I need 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, I need to do an act. I need, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this. They have that level of practicality to them. Which is why I think this has been such a revered text for so many, hundreds and hundreds of years. And there is also this other piece, which is that the way that the poem is laid out, from the chapter to the first verse of the 10 of each chapter and to the 10th verse, that that layout itself is part of the teaching. That arrangement is a kind of silent commentary, but silent only in the sense that it's waiting for us to hear it or to see it, to recognize it, and to notice how, and you can, often the last verse of a 10 will be a prelude to the first verse of the next 10. And the first verse will harken back to the previous 10, but also be announcing a new theme or a new take on a theme that's being explored. For instance, there's 6 chapters on friendship, and each chapter sort of looks at friendship from a slightly different angle, a slightly different point of view. And so when you read a work like this, you can read the individual verses, and you can also read the chapter, and then you can also read the work as a whole and see that there's this entire constellation of teachings, of poetic utterances which can reverberate with each other in really a glorious and deeply life-affirming and deeply practical way. Since I think we have enough time, is there any other verse that may have jumped out at you? It's always so interesting to me because, the verses that jump out to me may be different from those that jump out to somebody else. And there's something so beautiful in that because, a person could look at this book and think, oh, golly, now I need to learn all 1,330 verses, which is how many the book has. And yet there's a way in which there is an individual, entirely unique Kural that might meet any particular person, which consists precisely of those particular verses. It may be just 3 verses from the whole book, but they may speak to somebody in such a way that they find not only something of their own experience reflected back to them, but they find themselves in a place where new insights are growing from their own ground, if you will. So it's always a great pleasure for me to hear what resonates with other people. So is there maybe one more verse that...
I was struck by actually these 3 verses in a row, 474, 475, 476, failing to fit others, ignoring his limits and flaunting himself, a king falls quickly. Even the axle of a cart of feathers breaks if heaped with too many. If one at the end of a branch keeps climbing, his life is over. And I was struck by this image repeated of falling and falling and falling. And I mean, it's also in 473, and it's, it's in 479, like the falling is like a thing that happens with strength, evidently. But it's, what struck me here, it speaks to, I believe, like how much discernment is needed where it can be hard to discern limits. It can be hard to discern limits. That's what I was falling, is that, a king, and again, I don't know the cultural or historical context for the work. So I don't know how kings were seen, but when I think about my own background, going back to Europe and thinking about also Judaism and like divine right of rulers, it's like the king or the sovereign stands in as a stand-in for the divine, and the divine has unlimited strength. Like there are no limits, but human beings have limits, even when we're invested with the divine, even when we're connected to the divine. And when you ignore those limits, when you flaunt them, I think it's like ignoring and flaunting and falling. And it's the same way, like feathers, so hard to discern. Like if you're putting iron weights in a cart, it's like, oh, well, I think we're done now, but it's like, when's the last feather? It's, and similar with the end of a branch. It's like there's and of course with a branch in a tree, I leap to like the tree of life symbol, it's like, oh, climbing up the tree of life. It's a little too simplistic, but it jumped out for me. But I think that how do we really know limits? And how do we know when we're at the limit, when the next step is the fatal one, where it appears that we're still going higher, but the next step actually will take us down? And I think that, speaking about kings, speaking about leaders, my sheikh has a book, Children Around the Table of Allah, and there's a chapter in there called Eternal Stopping Places, and it talks about the caliphs, the vice regents who came in after the Prophet Muhammad passed, alayhi salam, and the ones who led the newly formed Muslim people, and how humble they were, how they kept turning back to the people and asking them, will you make sure that I don't exceed limits? Being like celebrating when, for instance, woman stands up and says, you were wrong about X, and the caliph is like, I'm so grateful you said that. And others saying, if you step out of line, don't worry, and knowing that how consequential it is to hold power over a people, and recognizing that, yeah, if you're a normal person, you make a mistake, you're not going to get your head cut off. But if you're leading a whole people and you make a grievous error and you go over limits, yes, there's forgiveness, and yes, there are consequences. And I don't want to stray too far afield from the verses themselves, but it just speaks to how hard it is to discern where the edge is. And yeah, that's what really struck me.
Well, these are some of my favorite verses from this chapter, and I too. I mean, I share so much of what you've been sharing yourself, of that. It's that fine awareness that one feather more. How could one feather possibly hurt? And yet there will be some point where it'll be just that bit more. And there's a couple different things that occur to me to say. One is that in the context of Tamil history, the history of this area, which is now called the state of Tamil Nadu, or the land of Tamar, there was a 20th century, an extraordinary 20th century Tamar poet, Subramaniya Bharadiyar. And he has a great line where he said, "We are all this country's kings. We are all this country's leaders." And I think that a work like this, because of its nature, is one that can be read into the 21st century in such a way that, we may not be in the context of the various forms of kingship that there have been in civilizations around the world. And yet we are also in a situation where we are called upon to enact in our communities, in our democracies, in whatever sort of communal political form of life that we are part of, to be able to embody certain leadership qualities, even just in our own homes. And so that is a piece that I wanted to put in there. And I also thought that it might be interesting. Well, I also have to add that I'm delighted by this sense of this recognition of this imagery of falling. It's nice we have the falling rain, almost as if to help make sure
it for sure. Yes.
it's in the air. And that this sort of some interesting paradoxical relationship between power and limits and a fall, the possibility of falling. And I have to say, this verse right in the center of the chapter, the 5th verse about the axle of carts of feathers, is, and I think I can remember the the original Tamar, so I thought I'd share at least one of these verses
Mhm.
that way. I'll share the translation and then the Tamar and then the verse, the translation again, just to give a taste of that aspect of the language. This is the fifth verse of this set of 10 and the 475th verse from the whole book. Even the axle of a cart of feathers breaks if heaped with too many. Bili pesa kardum atchirum, appandum sala migatu payin. Even the axle of a cart of feathers breaks if heaped with too many. And I personally
Can,
love this verse. Yeah, go
what,
ahead.
can you read the Tamil again?
Yes, of course. Bili pesa kardum atchirum, appandum sala migatu payin.
Thank you.
I was just going to say that I love this verse because it says such an important thing in such a, I think, a playful way. I mean, to talk about, the possibility of falling. This is heavy stuff, right? Heavy. I mean, gravity, all of it. I mean, the metaphors are
Right.
there, and at the same time, this way of expressing it, of giving us this image of this cart of feathers, is so playful and delightful, even as it points to the subtlety of that relationship, that possibility, that sense of the fineness of distinctions and of limits.
Mm.
I'm wondering if there's any questions you might have for me, Mark, about any of these other verses or about my own adventure in translating this work or anything that
Yeah.
occurs to you in this moment.
Can you tell me a little bit about the historical context, like just what like a taste of what the culture was like when he and I ask this because, in my tradition, in in the Quran, that the understanding the verses, they could be understood on their own without understanding it, but the stories from the life of the Prophet Muhammad, which are well known, they were not that long, 1400 years ago, the history is all documented quite well, um, enriches the understanding and the context so much. And so it just makes me, like I'm really curious the depth that's there. And so I didn't know if there was like a little taste of the history and how that touched your process of translation.
One piece is that, and it's about the Tamar language, which is really an extraordinary language, and it has the unique distinction of being a living classical language, by which I mean it is an ancient language which has a continuous literary history, more than 2,000 years into the present, unbroken. And that to me is astonishing. I mean, even our, European classical literatures, there's often a break between, say, the different forms of classical Greek and contemporary Greek, or something like that. Or we have a language like Latin, which doesn't have, we don't speak Latin. We speak, there are people who speak languages which have evolved out of or descended from Latin. Whereas Tamar is a language which has been rooted in this particular country, this particular region, for thousands and thousands of years, and has this literature growing out of that very specific place. So it is an indigenous language in that sense, even as it also contains within it. There have been many different kinds of people and many different dialects of Tamar, and there have been forest dwellers, tribals, one of the words used in Indian English to describe these people, who continue to this day too. So there's an enormous scope or breadth of experience there. And in the history of Tamar and the literature, there was a period of great flourishing known as the Sangam period. And Sangam here is a word that means association or gathering. And it alludes to a tradition of there being these associations, sangams of poets. And these would be poets who are active in the life of their communities. So poets are often advisors to kings, which I love, or to leaders of every kind. And even back 2,000 years, some of these most esteemed poets were women. And they were given in the language that is used to describe them as much or sometimes even more respect than some of the other male poets. So there's this long tradition of female voices and female poets. I actually had, in part of my apprenticeship to the Tamil language and to English and to poetry, I translated the work of a 12th century Tamil woman poet and saint named Avvayar, who also is coming from a wisdom teaching tradition. And so, so that's another element or strand that I want to highlight. And this particular work, the Tirukural, comes actually there's a long and ongoing and very lively debate about when exactly the work was written. A number of scholars tend to think it was maybe between the 3rd and the 5th centuries. CE, and that seems fairly reasonable enough. But what's more interesting to me as a poet is that comes toward the end of this period of flourishing. So there was this period of flourishing where there were these extraordinary love poems being written, extraordinary poems about community life, about leadership and war and conflict and ethics, and that tradition is in some ways woven together or synthesized into a very sort of interestingly harmonious and open work that this work is. And something that is important, I think, and relevant about the poet Thiruvalluvar is he has traditionally been thought to have been, and it rings true to me, a weaver. So this wasn't a priest, this wasn't a kind of scholar that didn't have a connection to sort of the material world. This was a weaver, and there's various ideas about sort of where he came in the caste hierarchy, the social hierarchy, but he was somebody who worked with his hands. Somebody who worked with the actual material of the world, the threads and fibers of the world. And so just as a weaver would be weaving a cloth together out of fibers which become threads, which become a cloth, so too we have a poet who was weaving together these different not only words and phrases into lines of poetry, but also traditions, ideas, deeply held and long-rooted beliefs about goodness, which of course, have been given expression for hundreds of years before this work was written, and yet find in many cases some of their most beautiful and memorable expression right here. And so that is a little bit of a taste of some of that context, which I really appreciate you asking about.
Yeah. I'm imagining that really played a part in your effort of translation. Like, did you, were you, I mean, it's impossible. Anyway, I'm imagining you were at least somewhat familiar with some of the works that preceded it and understanding this weaving and threading in the translation, like trying to, I'm curious, like how much you try or make the attempt or dream into inhabiting the world and the particular perspective that he was inhabiting in
Yeah.
the attempt to translate it.
Well, that's really a wonderful and a marvelous question. And part of the answer is that I had no intention to take on this project for 15, 17 years. It really didn't even occur to me. And at the same time, I was becoming acquainted with the tradition in such a way that I could say yes to the project when I finally did say yes to the project. Project is not even the right word. The challenge, the the task,
The
and
undertaking,
the
yes.
undertaking, indeed. That sometimes I feel like I've been taken under
Yeah.
by this work. But so, for instance, I first read it very closely in 2003, 2004, when I had a Fulbright grant, and I was living actually in my Tamil teacher's house. I was living there and studying with him during the week, and then on the weekends I'd go to a village where I had lived for a number of years prior to that, and so I was studying the literary written language with him, and then on the weekends I was sort of immersing myself in the spoken languages, particularly of this beautiful village that I had become very much a part of by that point. And so there was sort of the living context of these sort of the city and the countryside, if you will, that was already part of my experience. But that same year, when we read this work and all of its major commentaries, we also read some of the most important works of the Sangam period. Um,
Hmm.
Not just read them, but I memorized a number of those poems, and I came to really know them in a deep way. And I even learned how to write in Tamil in the same verse form of the Kural. I didn't write great poetry, but I did learn enough to be able to know, to taste, if you will, something from the inside of what it was to compose one of these lines. And there is a further mystery here, which is that in the years since I studied the work with my teacher formally, he would say things when I would see him again, or when he would call me. He'd say, um, somebody really ought to do a translation of this the Kural, and they should read all the commentaries you and I read. And I'd think, oh, great, of course, yeah, that would be something lovely. Somebody ought to take that on. And
Somebody should do that.
it it really didn't occur to me till years later, a dozen years later, when suddenly I thought, well, I'll give this a try. And I think it didn't even occur to me until it occurred to me, because precisely what you were alluding to, that there were all these pieces that had to come together. And there was my understanding and my lived experience of the Tamil language, of its of, elements of its literature, of the life as it continues to be lived, particularly in the villages where people embody these verses. I've witnessed with my own eyes, my own tongue, tasting their hospitality, how these verses are practiced. But there's
Broken cart full of feathers.
exactly. And then there's a whole parallel journey, which is the journey of becoming enough of a poet in English to be able to convey at least some suggestion of the riches there. And then there's a personal journey, which is that in my case, this work speaks particularly to the life of a householder, somebody who has a home, has a family, has a vocation, is part of a community. And there's a whole part, the three parts of the book. The third part of the book is about love relationships. And so, this other very crucial element was that I had, in some ways, to fall in love with the sweet beloved who is now my husband, and we set up a household, and we explore and experience in the depths of our own being, in the depths of the being of our relationship, many of the things that are spoken of in the chapters on love, and also in the chapters on home. And even though this work comes from a context, which could be said to be heterosexually oriented, even though that's not a word that existed in Tamil, and not even in English until very, very recently. That's a whole nother story we could explore.
So true.
Even though archetypally, there's the woman and there's the man. And even so, I have learned so much, on the one hand, about this work being in relationship with my beloved husband. And on the other hand, I've learned so much about that relationship from this work, about its inner dynamics, about what it means to have a home. What does it mean to be at home in a very rooted and practical, financial even sense, the sense of power, but also home in the larger sense of home in this world of ours, with its rain and its airplanes and its soil and its plants and its cycles of seasons.
Right.
So all of these different strands had to come together, and in some ways, for me, the great challenge was to dare to say yes to trying, and then to dare to try to see it all the way through, knowing that there will never be a perfect translation of any of these verses. To really taste the verse, you go to the original, and you can live with that, and you can and that can be the work of a lifetime.
Right.
And yet I
Right.
knew, and I had the sense, and my teacher had the sense, that there was something possible in English that could at least share some larger offering, some larger gift from the work. So that's a little taste of.
That's so beautiful. I really appreciate you describing all of that, and what it takes to really to live. I mean, in some ways in some ways, strike that. Just say, you had to live the work,
Yeah.
and so that answers very beautifully the question I asked about the context and the connection and the understanding that had to come. And yeah, just really honor all the love and care that you've put into allowing this to come through. And because it is quite something. It's very, very moving. I don't have words, but I know that it's affected me, and I'm very grateful to have this. So,
Well,
all
thank you.
blessings, and thank you.
Thank you, Mark, so much for saying yes to this conversation and for sharing not just your words, but your heart in this conversation. For those watching or listening, if you'd like to learn more about Mark's work and the work of Heart of Business, I invite you most heartily to visit heartofbusiness.com. Mark's newsletter is one of the few that I actually pay attention to, and that's been years of paying attention to, because it is really a rich offering and an extraordinary gift. So I commend that to your attention, and I thank you again, Mark, for your heart and for your presence, and for being here with me today in this work and in this conversation.
What a delight. I am so, so grateful. Thank you.